With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you today.
Thank you, Dr. Paul.
Good. The news has changed a little bit. We've heard a lot about ISIS. It's still in the news, but they're not the greatest threat in the world. It used to be last week, for last year or two, perpetual war for perpetual peace and spend more money and start a new engagement here and there. But this week, the greatest threat to our national security are those Russians. I guess they're going to march in. And my greatest threat, I wonder if it's greater than it was during the Cold War. But anyway, Joseph Dunsford, who's up for chairman of U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, was testifying before the Armed Services Committee, which is John McCain's committee, and he was chairman. And this is where he made the announcement that greatest threat to our security are the Russians and the Russian government. And for some reason, all of a sudden, it wasn't a big deal to be talking about ISIS. But I guess it depends on their mood and what they're doing. And guess what? John McCain sort of liked what he heard because, and he also, McCain obviously got into points. Oh, sure, things are, we have to do this, but we have to send more weapons, to Ukraine in order to counteract this great threat. And yet I think most of this is concocted. But did this just come out of the clear blue, or is there a strategy change in the administration?
Well, it's interesting that we see a coordinated effort, I think, because we saw the Dunford testimony before the committee this week, but we also saw a couple of weeks ago the release of the National Military Strategy of the United States. And that is also a shift because it focuses away from non-state actors as the greatest threat to the U.S., which, as you point out, we were told was the case, and it refocuses on state actors that are, quote, challenging international norms. And what that means in real terms is that any nation that pursues an independent foreign policy, and it specifically mentions Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, these are the greatest threats. The threat is the existence of sovereign states whose independence of action makes them, quote, revisionist states. That's what Paul Craig Roberts wrote about the new strategy that we have up on the Institute's website today.
I think they're good at orchestrating the PR when they are shifting gears like this, because this week the U.S. Air Force Secretary, Deborah James, was interviewed, and guess which words she used? Russia is the greatest threat to our national security. All of a sudden, this is it. They're ready to go. So they're sticking to the message. But some days I wonder whether we'll ever be interested in the greatest threat to our liberties, and that might not come soon, because then we have to hit home, closer to home, because that should be really our main concern about the threat to our liberties. But right now, though, this is being orchestrated obviously for 4 reasons that they don't tell us. But James, the Secretary of the Air Force, I think she sort of leaked out the real thing. She came down critical of our NATO allies, our buddies in NATO. They've done our bidding, in pestering Ukraine and trying to stir up trouble, participating, in the coup and the overthrow of the elected government of Ukraine. But she is upset, and she's upset now because of the 28 NATO countries. Only 4 of them are spending enough money buying weapons. And I imagine they're buying them from us, But they're supposed to, under the rules of NATO, spend 2% of their GDP on buying weapons. They say it's military and they say it's defense, but it's buying weapons is what it's all about. Who do you think is going to benefit from all these expenditures if she's able to get them to spend more money?
Yeah, well, certainly the military-industrial complex, both in Washington, Berlin, and Paris. Yeah. But it is interesting, this 2% was an aspiration that came out of the NATO summit last year, I think it was. But the fact of the matter is, even these 4 countries who are spending their 2% are relatively insignificant countries. One of them is Lithuania, which I think has about 15,000 men and women in arms. And the others, as I wrote about it in a recent article for the Institute, the real big players in Europe are actually decreasing their defense spending. Germany's at 1.2 or 1.3%. The UK has decreased its defense military spending. So these, on one hand, Russia is the greatest threat and obviously would be to Europe because it's next door. But these countries, their response to this great threat is to decrease their military budgets.
Of course, Greece continues to spend in their bankruptcy. But I think that's the important point that you make, that if this was a real threat, you know, that the tanks are going to roll in and take over Eastern Europe, there would be a little bit of concern. NATO would be begging and pleading for us to spend more money and do all these things, and they'd be willing to. No, they're not that much interested. So the reality of Russia being a real threat. Matter of fact, I think their tone, Putin's tone, is not always that soft tone because he doesn't want to be pushed around. But I think the tone has softened a little bit, and he even took the step of cutting off the gas to Ukraine because they're not paying their bills, which actually undermined. He didn't get some gas into Western Ukraine, and I don't. He just doesn't sound like somebody that is going to roll with the troops and the tanks all over Ukraine. I think that's the odds of that happening. It's just so remote, and yet they still have to build up this animosity.
I think the odds are there because there are ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine who don't like the way they're being treated, and they're being treated very badly. They're being shelled on a regular basis. So if the same were the case and there were a bunch of Americans in Mexico who were being shelled by the Mexican government, there would be certainly some concern in Washington.
And sometimes this warmongering comes from economic problems, the crises, the revolutions. That's when the countries go broke, and they have to try to resort to how are we going to take care of our country because of their huge debt. And I think this is something that they won't admit to. The problem that debt is the major problem throughout that region, and they are resorting to other things. Now, our policies toward Russia is actually creating an economic climate which may be the threat to the United States. Because, if they push too hard, you see Putin, although he doesn't have a really strong deck, he's not bashful. He will talk to the Greeks, and say, hey, look, we want to be your friend. He even talks to the Saudis, and theoretically say, yeah, what if the Russians and the Saudis get together? And we've already pushed him into the arms of the Chinese, and the Indians are going to be sympathetic to that group, not to us. And if our currency breaks down, and this currency system, if the entire dollar system breaks down like the euro breaks down, maybe somebody's going to fill this vacuum. And it may be that the biggest concern is the economics, because usually wars are fought over natural resources and over how you handle debt, who's going to pay the bills. So I think economics are very important here, but I think we have created a monster and a lot of harm, for the people of Eastern Europe and in Ukraine and all these areas. And of course, the mess in the Middle East is of our doing to the most part. And then we say, well, they're talking now about a lot of oil coming out of Iran. I hope that is the case where they have a settlement there. But even that isn't going to solve all the problems. There's still going to be a lot of economic factors going on. And I think we may be in worse shape economically than people admit, and we're resorting to these directions toward the military. This old theory that, war will distract the people from the real issue of the war and from the Depression.
Yeah, and if you read between the lines of this new military strategy, although it does mention China as a threat, it seems to soft pedal the threat a little. And I think, in the sort of the criminology of analyzing this report, you could suspect that the U.S. is concerned about China and Russia getting together. And you mentioned Saudi Arabia. We talked about it before the show, that we don't see a change in alliance happening overnight. But the Saudis aren't stupid people. They're probably hedging their bets.
Yeah, and I think we're less close to the Saudis than we were before, but we're very much engaged. We're partners in an illegal, unconstitutional, immoral war of bombing and killing. Just the other day, there were quite a few more, and I think there were some of the planes killed the wrong people.
In Yemen,
and we're part of that. So we have a moral responsibility. I'm sure we're financially liable for a lot of this as well. So we're locked in there, but not permanently. Things things can change rather rapidly, but I don't think Saudi Arabia is as they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that's our alliance, our close alliance with Saudi has been going on ever since Roosevelt, the end of World War II. And there's nothing that says that something like that is going to be permanent, so we'll have to wait and see. They're not, other than oil, would we have ever been a natural ally of Saudi Arabia?
Let's hope not.
And even now, what we overlook in order to try to play these games of going after our enemies, last week's enemy, ISIS and Al Qaeda, we align ourselves and get involved in these wars. And when you look at and then we condemn some countries for their human rights behavior, and then our best friends are the Saudis.
Yeah. So, it almost becomes comical when you look at the Dunford testimony, because it gets to the point where everything he says about Russia is really more true about the U.S. He says that the problem with Russia is it doesn't respect other nations' sovereignty. But look at how the U.S. bombed Libya. It's bombing Syria. It violates sovereignty on a regular basis. He says that Russia's military actions are undermining regional security. But what about moving NATO troops right onto Russia's border? Doesn't that undermine the stability?
I guess my message didn't get through. This meager suggestion about a foreign policy with a golden rule. Don't do to other countries what we don't want to have done to us. But you're absolutely right. If we do it, it's okay. If they do it to us, or even not do it to us, they get accused of doing it, which is not very healthy for the world.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and I want everybody to pay close attention to what's going on with Russia right now, because it has been declared the outright enemy of our national security above everything else. And this week, don't worry about ISIS and don't worry about Al Qaeda. That may come later. But like I said at the beginning, the real concern that we all should have is the concern for our liberty. And who is the greatest threat to our liberty? What happens to be here at home? It happens to be not only us who become apathetic and don't say much and put up with the spying on us, and apathetic on what our government tells us and lies to us and spies on us constantly. So our liberties are being undermined. And right now, we have been taught for the last 15 or 20 years that the only reason people dislike us is because we are rich and because we seek peace, and that just is not true. And they are resentful to us because we're in their face and in their country and meddling in their internal affairs. So I would say let us be concerned about our liberties and about our security, but the best security we can have is to mind our own business and take care of ourselves and provide a free and prosperous society so we can set an example for the rest of the world. That should be our goal. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.